We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. From the moment we open our eyes, a new day puts us back in the vice of reality. A curious blend of boredom and tension, fueled by relentless uncertainty. We watch our children grow. They ask if they can go outside to play. We always answer no, maybe in a month or so, but not today. By but one, our days turn slowly into months and months to years. All things conspire to grind us down till we grow weary being here. Time goes blindly marching on while we stand and wait, gazing at democracy from behind a padlocked gate. Then we retire. By but one, our candle flickers here in the night, then disappears.
Sometimes at night I lie there awake, try to fathom what sparked this insanity. Why are we locked up like rats in a cave and treated like the dregs of humanity?
We learned our lesson well. They bombed us into hell and made hell freeze. Now the same self-serving crew say we're jumpers of the queue, not refugees. Behind barbed wire, we watch your city lights spread out like a sea of stars. Behind barbed wire, you call us aliens as if we came from Mars. Borders drawn to keep us out of here and over there, while capital unfettered chases profits everywhere. When we retire, behind barbed wire, men and women just like you is all we are.
The walls and the wires of the camp, where they lock up our homes and chain our dreams. Are the governments of rebel stand? When the hostel burns and the migrants scream,
And the thugs take to the streets legitimized, spreading the hatred that breeds in the squalor of slums. March to the drum, live under the thumb. Behind barbed wire, we take the blame for what your system can't provide. Behind barbed wire, used like a curtain to conceal the class divide. The common thread that binds the nation and maintains the status quo, protecting power and privilege at the expense of those below. When we retire, behind barbed wire, another fence goes up around the ones outside.
Thank you very much for that wonderful beginning to our evening. And it's a shame that refugees still are behind barbed wire in Australia. My name is Nathan Kennedy. I'm the Vice President of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, and I welcome you this evening. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here tonight. I'd just like to tell you a bit about Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. We are a network of now over 3,000 members across the nation, and we are active in practicing and promoting awareness of international human rights standards in Australia. And if you're qualified to practice as a legal practitioner in Australia, or if you're studying or teaching law in Australia, or you're working in a legal capacity in Australia, you can join. So it's a fairly wide definition of lawyers. In the last year, we've made about 24 submissions to parliamentary inquiries in relation to human rights on a state and national level. The topics have ranged from terrorism to marriage equality and, of course, refugee rights. We're active in drafting opinion pieces, media releases, corresponding with governments, giving radio interviews, etc. So welcome to the fundraising event for the Asylum Seekers Centre, which provides practical support for asylum seekers in the New South Wales community. We have the generous sponsorship of Maurice Blackburn this evening, and we are privileged to hear from an expert panel on refugee rights in Australia and to view the Norwegian documentary film on children asylum seekers in that country, Nowhere Home. Before we begin our panel discussion, I'd first like to invite Giri Sivaraman from Maurice Blackburn to say a few words.
Thank you. Maurice Blackburn is very proud to sponsor this event. Maurice Blackburn lawyers have stood up for the oppressed and the vulnerable for their entire existence. And in the current political climate, where both major parties appear intent on adopting the most cruel or inhumane policy available towards asylum seekers, it's hard to find a more vulnerable and oppressed group within our society. I commend the Australian Lawyers for Human Rights for their courage and initiative in pushing an issue that's often deeply unpopular, and for organising this event. I wish the Asylum Seekers Centre all the success in the very important work that it will do helping those people within our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giri. I'd like to introduce you to our panel of speakers. They all have extensive experience in relation to refugee issues in Australia. The first to my left is Professor Mary Crock, whose main field of research is migration, citizenship and refugee law, most particularly refugee children and youth and refugees with disabilities. She is known for her work on immigration detention, but has also written and lectured on many other aspects of immigration and refugee law and their interface with other areas of laws and other disciplines. Mary helped to establish and run the Victorian Immigration Advice and Rights Centre in Melbourne, now known as the Refugee and Immigration Law Centre. She has assumed leadership roles as chair of various migration law-related committees for the Law Institute of Victoria, the Law Society of New South Wales and the Law Council of Australia, and has served on the Executive Committee of the Refugee Council of Australia. Next beside Mary is Dr. Thom, who has been Amnesty International Australia's refugee coordinator since 2000, working on behalf of individual asylum seekers, as well as on broader human rights issues relating to refugees. He has worked with the refugees and visited refugee camps around the world, and in 2012 he visited Christmas Island for the 4th time and also visited the detention facilities on Nauru. He publishes and lectures on domestic and international refugee issues and has represented Amnesty at UNHCR's NGO consultations in Geneva for the past 6 years. He completed his doctoral thesis on post-war migration at the University of Sydney in 2000. Since 2010, he has been on the board of the Asylum Seekers Centre of New South Wales, which, as I said, provides the practical support and assistance for asylum seekers living in the community, and he's wearing his Asylum Seekers Centre hat tonight. Natalie Young is the last on the panel, and Natalie is a senior solicitor and registered migration agent at the Refugee Advice and Casework Service, also known as RACS, in Sydney. She is soon to complete a Masters of Law at the University of Sydney, where we are today, where she has specialised in international law, including human rights. She's previously worked with asylum seekers in Egypt and undertook an Australian Youth Ambassador for Development program in Papua New Guinea. So please join me in welcoming our panellists this evening. Now please, if you have any questions during this discussion, please raise your hand. We've got roving mics. I've stolen one, but I'll hand it over. And just to keep the discussion going, but I might kick it off. Obviously we've had an election. I'm not sure if the policy of the new government's any different to the old, but I was wondering if each of you could express a view on where the policies sit at the moment, if you can, in a relatively brief way, and let us know what the landscape is at the moment, and I guess particularly in relation to children, given the topic we've got this evening. Mary, maybe start with you.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we have seen more than a competitive race to the bottom with our two major parties. I've been describing it as competitive dredging for some time now. As we stand today, there are apparently 1,743 children in immigration detention amongst 8,732 people, and we're talking serious detention, as in the camps, in addition to some 21,000 odd within the community living in limbo. Now, before we started, we were trying to work out exactly what the legal status of different people are at the moment. My assessment is that we are in a legal regime that is more confused and confusing than I've ever experienced in my 30 years of working in this area. I've counted, and I stand to be assisted by my colleagues here, possibly 9 statuses of people who are in Australia claiming asylum as refugees at the moment. Now, under international law, it should not be that complicated. We've signed the Refugee Convention. That requires us to grant asylum to people who are on our territory who meet the definition of refugee. Instead, what we have is if you come by plane, you get the whole range of benefits and legal structures that have been created over a good 30, 40 years in this country. So you get an interview with the department, which has now renamed itself, and you get rights of appeal, etc. And if you make it through and you are recognised as a refugee, you're welcomed as a permanent resident in Australia. You're given immediate access to social security and you become a citizen within 4 years. Now, for those who come by boat over the seas, there are now 8 different statuses depending on when you arrived and who was in power. And I think what I find most interesting is that what we've seen is both sides of both of the major parties conspiring to try to create like a legal void almost for these people, so that if they are in Australia, they have no right to any of the benefits of the Migration Act, and presumably, as they would like, no right to any form of appeal. Now, what is interesting is that we now have people who are physically in Australia, people who have been sent by us to Nauru, and people who have been sent by us to Papua New Guinea, to Manus Island. To complicate matters, you have people who've been sent to Nauru and sent to Papua New Guinea and brought back to Australia. This is how I get my 9 categories. But according to the period you've been here, whether you arrived before the 13th of August 2012, after 2012, August 2012, after the 19th of July 2013, and now after the election as well. Because interestingly, the biggest change that I see, and I'll hand over now to my colleagues, the biggest change that I see is that when the Now government was in opposition, they were a vociferous, very loud opposition. Every moment of the day they would be saying, you can't trust Labor, they've lost control of the borders, I wrote an article in 2010 saying that the rhetoric of the then opposition, to the effect that our borders are open and government was out of control, was actually playing into the hands of the people smugglers. The biggest change for me, post the election, is not a change of policy, but we no longer have an opposition. That we no longer have this rhetoric that's going out around the world saying, oh, Australia's lost control of its borders. Actually, nothing has changed on the policy front, but in terms of the rhetoric and the way people are behaving, everything has changed. And interestingly, if I was to write this up, I would be calling my article All Quiet on the Western Front, because the first thing that our new Minister of Immigration did was to shut down the cone of silence and to say, I'm going to give you a briefing once a week, but I'm not going to tell you what we're doing. So you have Indonesia taking it seriously for the first time in 10 years. And the boats were slowing before, they have really slowed now, but they won't stop. And what I find fascinating is they've drawn a line under what was happening before the 7th of September, and anything that happens after that, they're saying, 48 hours, we're moving you out. And so I think they've quietly brought a whole lot of people back to make more capacity on Manus Island and Christmas Island and other places. And they are now having this 48-hour turnaround to send everybody, women, children, pregnant, single, unaccompanied, everybody's being sent offshore, we think, but we don't really know. So it's all quiet on the Western Front, and thank goodness we still have a Senate where we're going to be able to get information, because it's going to be harder and harder to find out what the hell's going on.
I mean, just following on from that, I think what is key in what Mary is saying is the uncertainty that we're seeing at the moment. And as Mary has pointed out, we're talking about something like 30,000 people who are now in a perpetual state of uncertainty. If it's difficult for us to understand which of the 9 categories these people fit in, imagine if you're out there either in the community on Christmas Island or on Nauru trying to work out what particular process relates to you, and when is this going to start, and how is it going to start, and what's going to happen when and if you are actually found to be a refugee. And we need to remember that a significant number of those 20,000 people in the community have been waiting for over a year for their process to even begin. They now don't even know what that process is going to look like and what's going to happen at the end of it. And we talk about, what's happened since the election. The temporary protection visa, I think, is going to be a serious game changer for a lot of those people who are now, if, as we understand, and we don't know, again, the uncertainty is there, we don't know what the legislation is going to look like. We think they're going to backdate it so it'll cover all of those people, but what will happen to them then? We've been told before the election that it'll be a 3-year temporary protection visa, or up to 3 years. People will then have to reapply for a further 2 years, but then any sort of permanency will be at the discretion of the minister. So this explosion, this increase of executive power at the expense of due process is something that we've already started to see, and that we're going to further see. The erosion of any legal protections for people seeking asylum is going to carry on at the growth of power of the executive to be able to determine who goes where and what's going to happen to them. What happens if somebody is found to be a refugee on Nauru? We don't know. Will they be allowed out of detention? We don't know. There's nowhere for them to go. So we're going to be detaining, or the Nauru government is going to be detaining recognised refugees. But then a lot of the people who've gone through their process, as Mary has highlighted, are now back in Australia. What happens if the officials on Nauru find somebody to be a refugee who's now back in Australia? Will Australia recognise that, or will they have to go through the whole process again? So it's that uncertainty that is also causing considerable harm to the asylum seekers who are currently in the process. And that's what we're seeing putting on my Asylum Seekers Centre hat, the people who are coming to us. I was highlighting before that nearly half the people who are coming to us are essentially homeless when they come to see us. Now, we're talking about 1,000 clients that we've had recently. So the level of destitution in the community is only going to get worse. You know, people who are on $210 a week without any work rights, paying $180 a week on rent, they've got $30 to spend on food a week. That's it. How are these people going to survive? And I think that's something that we're going to increasingly see in the next few years, a real underclass of people that we've never seen before in this country.
I think the current government's policies are just continuing the legacy of the previous governments and getting worse. I think it's characterised by three themes, all starting with E: erosion, exclusion and exceptionalism. So the first significant change, in my view, is the change of name of the Department of Immigration and Citizenship to the Department of Immigration and Border Protection. It's a very exclusionary name, and I think that semantic point is very significant, and that was one of the first things the department did. The second thing, as Professor Crock has touched upon, is to do with the gag on any information about boat arrivals. So under Operation Sovereign Borders, boat arrivals and migration has been painted as much more of a, as I said, a border control issue, and getting the involvement of the military is very much symptomatic of that. And as we know, the Minister for Immigration is giving very brief information in his media releases on the grounds that it's operational. So you don't need to know how many people arrive from week to week, it's just operational. It's not, you know, it's not in the public interest to know an issue. So as the other panellists have touched upon, when you have this gap in public information, that's when human rights violations can really occur, because no one knows what's going on, and that silence is very scary. The third significant point is the announcement that temporary protection visas will be introduced. Obviously Parliament hasn't sat yet, but when they do, we'll probably see the changes to those laws, perhaps just enlivening the TPV regime from the Howard era. Scary things about the TPV regime are the sense of limbo and hopelessness that asylum seekers will face on those visas. But I think there's two very important points about them. First is that under the TPV, you cannot bring over your family members, you cannot sponsor your family members located offshore, so people can't bring their spouse or their children, and they're just stuck in Australia not knowing what the future brings. The second point about TPVs is how they are going to relate to stateless persons. So stateless persons are people who have no nationality, obviously, and the idea of a TPV is it's a temporary protection visa, which is after 3 years, the situation in your country of origin is looked at again by a decision maker, and if it's deemed safe to return, it can be returned. But stateless people like Rohingya in Burma, Palestinians, there's lots of other groups, there's nowhere for them to be returned to. So I'm curious to see how this will operate in regards to stateless persons. It's a very unfair policy, specifically in regard to them. And the offshore transfer issue is obviously going to continue, so either to Nauru or to Manus Island. The capacity in both of those places is stretched, people are living in tents, and Australia continues to maintain that the transferees are not our legal responsibility, and under international law they clearly are. So I think those are some of the main issues.
Thank you. Are there any questions arising out of that? There are. We've got a handy volunteer. Just picking up on your point about, I guess, asylum opposition at the moment. Once the opposition becomes more vocal, given the policies that they had before the election, do you think they're going to be a strong opposition on the refugee front?
Well, as Senator Carr was making what many interpreted as his farewell speech to caucus, he warned the right faction of the Labor Party not to weaken, and recommended that they form lockstep with the government on the asylum seeker issue. Otherwise, he said that they're at risk of being pilloried by the government in the same way that they were in the 50s, at the time of the Communist Party case. And unfortunately, I think there'll be a lot of certainly people on the right of the Labor Party who think like that, think that they can't afford to be seen as opposing the government in any of these areas. And it's a great shame. Look, what I was trying to tell you before was that we're really in a terribly messy situation at the moment. And for me, one of the strengths of what's happening is that you've got 30,000 people in Australia, and you have to deal with those people at some time, at some stage. In some ways, I'm a bit surprised that the government hasn't had regulations for the temporary protection visas ready to go. They're not hard to draft, and regulations, in fact, can be introduced at any time. You don't have to have Parliament sitting. You have to table regulations after Parliament sits, but you can actually make regulations at any time. To me, that speaks of a government that's not as sure of itself as we might think that it is. And that, I think, reflects the fact that you have such a mess. I'm sorry, real mess. We've never had asylum policy in such a state in this country before. And the complication is that these people are in the community. And when they're in the community, they actually humanise it. That's one of the reasons why the Howard policies really faded and eventually were met with such opposition last time. They're real people to a lot of people now. And you see, I think we'll find advocates in the left finding it easier to organise now under a coalition government than was the case under Labor. I think there was a lot of confusion about, where we should be going and what should be happening. So I'm not actually as depressed as some people are about what's happening at the moment, just for the simple reason that the people are there, they're in their community, and you can't get rid of them. So we will have to do something, and whether it forces all of us to organise to create social enterprises around the place. You've got close to 30,000 people there. You don't know what Clive Palmer wants to do. He's going to be an interesting character. He is. He's not in anybody's pay, and he won't be impressed with the price tag that goes with these policies. We're looking at $9 billion over a few years. I mean, most of the aid budget is being siphoned and drawn down to pay for this stupid offshore processing. It doesn't work. I mean, offshore processing, detention, all of these deterrent measures have never worked. They never will. What works is serious agreements with the transit and source countries, and that's where we're having real purchase at the moment. And I know as a lawyer I'm not supposed to be talking about this stuff, but that's where you stop boats. You don't stop boats by detaining people, or indeed by sending them off to other countries. All you do is you spend an awful lot of money, maybe on your mates, but it's a very interesting, politically interesting situation, and legally interesting, because once these people are here, you can't exclude the courts. You can stop them going to the tribunals. Well, great. They'll all go to the High Court. Before you know, we'll have 5,000 people, and you can't run class actions anymore. Oh, actually, you might be able to. You know that? You might be able to, because all of that fine, intricate structures set up to stop usual refugees. If you come by plane, you can't join a class action, but hey, why can't you join a class action? Why couldn't you run a class action? Of course you could, because the Migration Act doesn't apply. These people are in a legal vacuum.
I mean, one other interesting point that I didn't mention is what we're seeing now is also a number of people in the community who are on these 6 months visas. Those visas have come to an end and they're not being renewed. And so increasingly we're seeing people in the community with no visa status at all. And I think this is somewhere that potentially we might hear something from the opposition. If we're talking about illegals, this government is actually creating its own class of illegals through its incompetence. It's quite incredible. But,
and I'd like to ask the lawyers present what they think about this idea. What about the equitable remedies of declaration and injunction? Seeking declarations that your client is a refugee, seeking an injunction to stop them being removed. Problem solved.
There's a partner over there, Nick.
We have actually tried to do that. That's not quite as simple as it seems.
No, it's not, is it?
For lots of reasons. We at Morris Blackburn have run a number of cases, significant litigation for refugees, no class action, but I've had some of those cases. They're very difficult cases because, firstly, your client can get moved without you being told. So, for example, I was representing a refugee who, when I started acting, was in a detention centre that I could access, and then without me being told, was moved to the other end of the country. Or they can be moved overseas before you can take any action.
That's exactly what
And there are other issues, and I think in terms of running a case, you have to try and pick one that will establish a principle that will assist everyone else.
What about one of the Nauruans who've been recognised by Nauru as a refugee, who's been moved back here? You could certainly go for a declaration. I just think there's hours of fun. The only thing that you can say is that if they're in Australia, we can go to court. We will go to court. People will. All the jurisprudence suggests that you can't exclude judicial review from this. It's just a matter of working out how and why and when.
I think that's a really important point in terms of the gulf between a legal right that exists in our common law, and since N61 in 2010, the High Court said that the refugees offshore can access the courts, but that right is very hard to realise in all circumstances when physically you can't access the clients, you can't get in contact with them because the detention centres are actually prohibiting them from accessing lawyers, and this is a really real issue at the moment. We have something going on called enhanced screening, where people are interviewed by the Department of Immigration quite soon after arriving in detention centres, and they're either screened in or out, and that's to work out whether they lie in our international obligations or not. Lawyers are not present. Lawyers are not present for these interviews, and we don't know what really goes on in these interviews, and even getting information through freedom of information about these interviews has been very difficult. And when clients have contacted us at RACS to try to get some legal advice about the screening procedure, we're finding it very hard to get contact with them on the phone because the detention centre are not facilitating it or that sort of thing. So physical access is a huge barrier to actually realising these rights that do exist in our common law, but how do you realise them?
Does anyone have any questions at this point in the audience? Yeah, okay.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the legal implications of having contractors working at the detention centres, and also the policy implications of that, meaning that, well, I don't really know a lot about it, but I'd like to know about whether it is actually true that they don't know everything that's going on in the department because contractors are involved in the detention centres.
Well, the move to privatise a lot of what is done used to be done traditionally by the Department of Immigration. It's one that certainly has involved privatising the detention centres as well as everything else along the way. Generally, I would say that the department has got a pretty good idea of what's going on in the centres. what it does is it makes it more difficult to hold the operators to account, but not impossible. So the centres are still overseen by the Ombudsman and by the Human Rights Commission. They go in and do visits. So I think the other thing that has happened in recent times is the detention centres are not the really prohibitive places that they were in 2001 to 2004. The razor wire has come down in most instances. Some of the fences are still electrified, but people are communicating much more closely than they used to be. So I think problems arise in the detention centres when populations rise. And one of the concerns that we have at the moment, I think, is that we're in such a period of limbo with not knowing what this new government is going to do. There's a real lockdown. They're not ministers across all of the fields. They're not giving information out on what's happening. We're not allowed in to see the ministers either. Our new minister has seen a couple of people, but generally the Prime Minister is dictating to all of his ministers that they should not be talking to anybody until they work out what they're going to do. So there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of ignorance about what's happening at the moment.
Just carrying on from what Mary said, this becomes even more problematic offshore, where you have a number of contractors either doing the security or the activities or the health on Nauru and Manus Island, none of whom are in a position or are told quite explicitly you are not allowed to tell the asylum seekers there anything about their status. And of course all these people want to know is what's happening with the process, what's going on. And they legally put up their hand and say, we are not allowed to tell you. And so that just feeds the uncertainty that's going on there. And when, for instance, on Nauru, they're constantly told, sorry, this is all under Nauruan law, but no Nauruan officials are ever going in, so they can't actually speak to a Nauruan official. The Department of Immigration sits outside the centre as well, so they can't actually talk to the Department of Immigration, who in reality are pulling all the strings because they've got all the contracts. So it does create a lot of problems because it just feeds the uncertainty for those people. And with the riot that we saw earlier on, had there actually been somebody in the centre that could have been talking to those people and saying, you know, your process is actually quite well advanced. In fact, your process is probably more advanced than the people back in Australia. It could have done a lot to alleviate some of those frustrations, but without it, we're just going to see things go from bad to worse. And that's really one of the major concerns when you privatise what's going on, and to be able to siphon off who can actually give advice to the people who are in there.
Yeah, I guess another dimension to it is obviously the dilution of legal responsibility. So there's a duty of care owed, and then you contract out to a contractor, and they can subcontract, and so on and so on. So if you ever wanted to establish breach of duty of care, in a civil claim, then it's going to be more complicated. And I think that's part of the whole regime of this dilution of responsibility.
Any other? There's one just behind you.
In my view, one of the most destructive features of the present regime is the prohibition on those in the community from working. I speak from experience. We have an asylum seeker living with us who's a young man, bright, smart, really keen to get on with his life, who isn't allowed to work. That's really destructive. My question is prompted by your reference to Clive Palmer. Clive Palmer seems to me to come from the sort of his viewpoint seems that everybody ought to be made to work, not prohibited from work. Is there some scope for the opposition and Palmer getting together to at least try and bring about the result that people are allowed to work
to see some sensible reforms in this area relative to what Labor was doing, then we would have been under a Labor government. The no advantage test, what a nonsense. What an absolute nonsense. And the new government is not bound by any of that. Even moving towards temporary protection visas is a real advance. It's a real step up on the no advantage test, because the no advantage test was just ridiculous. It meant that people can't work period for 5 years. That makes absolutely no economic sense whatsoever, because it just is a total burden on Australia without giving these people any ability to support themselves and to work. And in fact, I actually think that this time around, temporary protection visas can, relative to what we've been seeing, be a real step forward.
I mean, I disagree somewhat about temporary. Well, I agree it's a step forward in terms of no advantage, and I think the work, as you pointed out, work rights is crucial, and that's what we're seeing a lot at the Asylum Seekers Centre. People without that ability to work are destitute, and the money that they've been given, is less than the lowest form of Centrelink, and you just cannot survive on that. Issues around, affordable housing are almost impossible. Ability to access services, to even attend interviews. It's just feeding the despair that these people are facing. I don't like temporary protection visas for a number of reasons, and the separation of family, I think, is the thing that also really damages people, but that's what we were seeing under the no advantage anyway, that separation added with uncertainty, added with no work rights. I agree, I think it's crucial, but even then, a number of people, once they're given work rights, it doesn't mean you can find work, and that's part of the problem with the temporary protection visa. It's, again, a step up from being on some form of bridging visa, because if you go to an employer and say, I'd like to work, well, what does TPV mean? Does that mean next week you're gone? Why would I employ you? It's important, but it's not the ultimate solution, because it's still very, very hard for people without proper support and without any sort of permanence to be able to access the labour market. I agree, though, it is a crucial step.
What I find fascinating is it's all predicated on these measures collectively stopping the boats. If they do stop the boats, then there's a lot of scope there for quietly letting these people melt into the community. And you won't know about it, it'll just happen, and people will be slowly given permanent residence. At the end of the day, it's all about smoke and mirrors and trying to deter people. My concern is that you cannot replicate what happened today. You can't replicate what they achieved in 2001 today, because the world is a totally different place. You can't put a cone of silence on people, because people are able to communicate. And what we've seen in history is that temporary protection visas have never worked as a deterrent. In fact, the opposite is true. Temporary protection visas actually, historically, have led to more women and children coming on the boats, for the simple reason that you can't sponsor them legally. And there's no reason in my mind to suggest that this won't happen again. That people will want to be with their families, they want to be with their families. The only way to achieve that will be by bringing them in through some form of illegal migration.
I'm not sure of any easy answer to this, but is there any way of publicising what's gone on in Italy in the last couple of weeks, the reaction of the Italian government, the humanity shown by the Italian government, compared to what we do here?
I mean, it is fascinating. I mean, I was on Lampedusa last year, and so, I've met the Lord Mayor of Lampedusa, who is just a fantastic person, very supportive of refugees and migrants' rights. And I mean, the loss at sea that we've seen in the Mediterranean, you know, is replicated around the world. But the fact that you've had state funerals in Italy and this public outpouring of grief, I think, you know, is very different to what we see in Australia. And how do we change that in this current environment without an effective opposition voice on this? I think it's going to be very difficult, but I think it is, you know, a really significant example of the way you can bring back some humanity into what is a human experience and should be about the protection of human beings. That's the sort of rhetoric that we've lost anything about, you know, the fundamentals of seeking protection and human beings. As Natalie pointed out, it's all about border control and security and putting a military smokescreen up there, so we don't view this as a human issue, which we saw in Italy, which, you know, for what was a horrible tragedy, at least there was something positive seen from the body politic.
It also puts it in perspective. Like, Australia is not the only country in the world by any means to have the problem of irregular migration. It's a global issue. Let's look at it in a global context. And what the Australian government does, in my view, is grossly overestimate pull factors. So thinking, you know, naively that we can just twinkle with our policies a little bit and it's going to affect the decisions people make to travel across borders and seek asylum. People will always be making those decisions because of the push factors, because of the conflicts and the issues that arise that make people need to leave, be forced to flee their countries. So focusing more on the push factors, so on democracy building and working in fragile states, working in transit countries for refugees and source countries for refugees, that's going to be more likely to reduce the need for irregular migration from the beginning, rather than focusing on trying to deter it from the end point.
Yeah, I've got to say, it does underscore the huge complexity of this area though, because there are a lot of people who don't want to see asylum seekers on boats. I'm certainly, we're, I think, all amongst those people. Anybody who's been in Indonesia and seen the way that the smugglers are operating, they are really not nice people, and it's like playing Russian roulette with your life. Unless you've got someone on your boat who is significant enough to merit being delivered at the other end, the chances that you're going to end up on a boat that is very unseaworthy are really quite large. Now, the percentage of people who die coming out here, I think, have been exaggerated by governments in the past. I think Mark Hutton refers to them as wishful thinkings, as ways in which people are trying to put morality around what they're doing. By the same token, 2% loss is too high, however you look at it. And so you do want to have a situation where we have policies that stop people getting on boats. At the same time, asylum is a reality, and it's just what we're doing at the moment is ridiculous. It really is. It's just prohibitively expensive, cruel, and totally abusive of human rights. So there has to be better ways to do it. For me, the only way forward is to try to get our major political parties to stop playing politics with this and to stop trying to score points off each other. If we were able to do that so that we could have sensible discussions with the source countries and transit countries so that we offered protection to people who need protection, but the nonsense people go on about taking the sugar off the table, assuming that people come here because we are a soft touch. If that has happened, it's purely because of what the politicians have done with the way that they talk and carry on. So yeah, we really have the messiest legal situation I've ever seen in my life, probably in any country in the world. There's nothing approximating this in terms of the legal complexities of people's situations. with the change of government, let's hope that we can get our politicians to start behaving like adults and really look for some real solutions instead of playing politics.
I'll just project. Is there a state you could point to which you think is doing a good and humane job dealing with asylum seekers?
Oh, well, I mean, most other countries in the world there's no country that's carrying on the way that we are at the moment. We really are out on a limb by ourselves here. So, duh.
But who would we like to be like?
Who would, we have conservative governments in Canada at the moment who are doing their best to try and copy us, believe it or not. So, you know, any other country, start with our motherland. England's doing a better job than we are. Italy is interesting because they look like that they're being very welcoming. In fact, they're just sort of ushering people through to the rest of Europe. There's a bit of flip passing happening there.
So what's been really interesting, and this was pointed out by UNHCR recently, that 10 years ago, 70% of the world's refugees were in the south, the developing countries. That's now 80%. In the last 10 years, Western countries have got a lot better at strengthening their borders and making sure that the problem is not coming onto their doorstep, and Australia is part of that. And as Mary's pointed out, we're now extreme in how we're doing that. You know, a classic example is looking what's happening in Syria and looking at how Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey have responded to significant 2.5 million people who were forced to flee. Something like 13% of Lebanon is now Syrian refugees and asylum seekers. You know, the numbers are huge, and yet the generosity they've shown is quite something when you compare it to particularly Australia, but Western Europe as well. You know, so we're not alone in adopting these sorts of hardline policies, but what's really concerning is the way that we are trying, through our policies, to delegitimise the right to seek asylum, and you know, maintain this fantasy that there are legitimate channels. And you can imagine the Australian government trying to talk to Jordan and try and tell them about legitimate channels that these, you know, 1.5 million people should have come through to enter their country. I mean, it's a nonsense. You know, we can only hope that Jordan maintains its generous approach in the face of some of the policies like Australia's.
We have a bunch of Syrians who are on the boats. All the boats that are coming out now have got Syrians on them. We've just agreed to take in how many?
500.
500, yeah, great. They're talking about 10 million refugees from Syria over the next few years, if it keeps going like it is at the moment. So we take in 500 legally. The ones who come by boat, however, we say that no, they're like plague rats and they have to be subjected to all of these exclusionary methods. I just spent 3 weeks doing field work in Uganda. That is a dirt poor country, and yet what they are doing is they have put aside hundreds of kilometres of land for the settlement of refugees. They receive large numbers of refugees from, if you look at Uganda, the borders, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Somalia, Ethiopia. They get refugees from all of those areas. It's a signatory to the Refugee Convention, and it actually gives whole tracts of land over to these people. Now, there are problems that they have there, but hell, wouldn't that be something if we set aside tracts of lands and made up whole cities for refugees? Now, if they can do that, then Australia, what are we up to?
Not to step down on this Australia bashing, but I will just add that a lot of countries who host refugees, developing countries who host refugees, is out of necessity. So obviously in Africa, water crossings, it's easier for people to get in more picky and choosy about who we accept. So it's not all out of generosity, a lot of it is pragmatism as well.
We'll have to stop the panel discussion there because we're just going to invite you to step outside and have some canapes and refreshments before we have the screening, but I'm sure the panellists will be sticking around, so maybe could talk to you outside.
We shall not give up the fight, we have only started. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight, we